Okay. All right, everyone. Like I said, welcome to our eTRANSERVICES SmartSimple Cloud webinar series. Our webinar topic today is building smarter grant applications with SmartSimple Cloud. This webinar is focused on making the most of your SmartSimple Program Manager to build customizable application forms and processes. Just a note, today's session is being recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel as well as on our website. And we will send this out as well. I am Karina Quinn and I'll be your host and facilitator for today's webinar. So I will be helping facilitate the Q&A session. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to type them in the chat and I will make sure our presenter, Jamie, will answer all of them during our Q&A session at the end. Now, I'd like to introduce you to Jamie Neal, our Program Manager for Digital Services at eTRANSERVICES, who will be presenting today's webinar. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karina. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to give you a quick summary of our topics today. I'm going to start with an overview of grant programs and the SmartSimple Program Manager. Then we'll talk about smart applications and how they work. And then I'm going to give you a demonstration, and then we'll have a brief Q&A after that. So as Karina said, if questions come up, just put them in the Q&A chat, and then we'll get to them at the end. Okay, so what is a grant program? Most of you probably already know this, but a grant program is a financial assistance initiative provided by a government, nonprofit, or corporate organization to support individuals or organizations in achieving specific goals or objectives. So typically, grant programs are purpose-driven. They have requirements for eligibility. They have an application and approval process. They can be competitive or not. And they have specific reporting requirements after award. For this webinar, we're going to focus on how to use SmartSimple's Program Manager to apply business rules to your applications. So making them more flexible from call to call with less need for configuration changes and maintenance. The SmartSimple Program Manager has a hierarchical structure. Programs can typically span multiple years or application cycles. For every program, you can have multiple cycles or calls for application. A call for application is just a way for organizations to announce that they're ready to accept grant applications for a specific program. Some other common terms that you may be familiar with are cycle, RFP, grant round, or funding opportunity. For this webinar, we're going to use the term call since that's what our demo system uses. A call is usually bound by a start and end date with eligibility and submission requirements defined. Each call can have different requirements for eligibility, budget, application data, review, and reporting. If you're already a SmartSimple user, you're probably familiar with the Program Manager UTA. The Program Manager is used to launch an application. Programs are divided into calls, which are typically activated on a cyclical basis. So when a call is open, that means applications are being accepted for that program. Calls are typically open for a specified period of time, but that's not always the case. They can also be open indefinitely or closed whenever all funds have been awarded. In many typical SmartSimple configurations, you have visibility logic set on your apply button to determine whether an applicant can apply. So that's usually based on whether the call is open and then whether the call deadline has passed or not. There may also be other conditions that are checked, such as whether your profile is up to date or whether you've already applied. Clicking the Apply button creates a new application. The Apply button generally has some combination of hard-coded and variable logic to determine what type of application to start. And then what status to start it from. The application that's launched has a business process and form fields on the application type. Visibility permissions by type determine which fields and buttons appear and how the application will behave. This type-based configuration is great if your program needs are fairly simple, rarely change, or are standardized across the organization. If your programs all have the same approval process, reporting requirements, and the same application fields, you may not need to build a smarter application. However, that's rarely the case. The more complex or adaptable your applications need to be to conform with changing program requirements, the more flexibility is needed in your configuration, and that's where the smarter applications come into play. So what do we mean by a smarter application? A smarter application uses fields on the program call to influence the behavior of its fields, buttons, and workflows. You set up the call, and the application adjusts to the settings accordingly. How do we build a smarter application? Planning ahead is really important. So start by creating a common application first. Determine the fields, buttons, and workflow tasks that are common to all applications. Here's where simplifying and streamlining your application and approval processes ahead of building is critical. Next, decide what you might want to customize about your applications to meet changing program needs. Are there fields used for some applications but not others? And does that change from year to year? Will you want to have the ability to add an ad hoc question or two to the application? Do you have different instructions for some fields based on the program or application type? Do you have different request amount thresholds or different review criteria? Then you want to decide what types of business process flexibility your applications might need. Do you need the ability to add a pre-application or LOI to some applications? Do some programs require an eligibility quiz? And does it change from year to year? Do you need an external review or another level of internal approval? Is the award process the same for all programs? And then what about the grant agreement rules? Last, decide what kinds of rules might apply to your application activities. Do some programs need progress reports? How many and how often? Will there be site visits? Does every program need a final report? Are all payments processed the same way? Once you configure the business rules on your call and configure the applications to follow those rules, the rest is easy. With rule-based calls and smarter applications, staff only needs to change a few field selections at call setup time. There's no need to reconfigure every year as program needs change. So how does it work? You have your program manager call, and then you have your application manager, which is sometimes called submission manager or grant manager, but it's all the same thing. And this is where your applications live. Then you have what's called a provider-consumer relationship, which is really just a fancy way of saying that these two objects are linked together. This allows you to use data from one object to influence behavior on another object, in this case, from call to application. You have a controlling field or rule on the call that has values you can select. The rule value you select will alter the behavior of the application field that it corresponds to, either by making a field visible, dictating the number of fields that appear, or dictating the values that can be selected. You can also have a rule that dictates whether a button shows. That means by enabling specific buttons, you can change the target status of an application, skipping or adding steps along the way, and thus altering the application or approval process. You can also have a rule control your workflow logic, so that a workflow task may branch one way or another, either adding new tasks or bypassing them. All of these application rules are applied without having to reconfigure the application itself. When the call is set up, staff simply makes selections on the rule fields. Those settings are propagated to all applications connected to that call. Now I'm going to demonstrate the implementation of our smarter applications in our demo instance. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. So let's start with a program manager. I have an open call for applications, which means we're ready to accept grant applications for this program. I'll show you how to set up the business rules on the call and then what the application looks like when those rules are applied. This first tab has some basic information about the call. There's descriptive information and some eligibility and review criteria, and then a little bit about the funding. The information is sometimes published in a PDF so that applicants can see a summary of the program requirements in their portal. So that's this here. The next tab is where we start to define the behavioral rules of the application. First, we define how many stages of application we want by indicating whether or not to include an LOI. In this case, I'm going to say no. We also define the dates the application is due, and this allows us to control when the application is available in the portal, the apply button is visible, and the submit button on the application is also visible. If the deadline passes, those buttons will disappear. The next thing we'll look at is the application start rules. We can define the application type here. A lot of times you'll see this being a one-to-one relationship between the program type and the application type, but the goal here is flexibility. So I'm choosing my common application type here, and then I'll add or subtract from that application to fit the program needs. We can also decide if this call requires an eligibility quiz. So I can say yes or no. If I do, certain fields, buttons, and workflow tasks are enabled on the application to make sure that my eligibility quiz shows and that the eligibility validations allow or prevent the completion of an application. We can select the starting status of the application here. This means that rather than having a default status for all applications, I can direct the application where to start in the process. So I can start from an LOI draft or a draft. I can start an internal draft. I can invite an applicant to apply. But since I selected to have an eligibility quiz, I want my application to start there. We can decide whether there will be an external review process. If there is, I'll have to set up the review criteria ahead of time. If not, the application will skip that step, and the workflow tasks that set up external reviews will be skipped as well. Then we can also decide if the application is going to require an executive approval. So in this case, we're going to say no. This will also impact the application process by rerouting to another approval status when needed. Since we elected to have an eligibility quiz, I can set up the eligibility questions here. I decide how many questions I want to ask. In this case, I have from 0 to 4 questions that I can add here. And then I can define the actual questions. So this makes it easy to change the eligibility quiz from call to call, so it's easier to adapt to new requirements. We can also customize the pass and fail messages that appear after the quiz is taken. On this tab, we can set up specific sections and fields to appear or be hidden on the application. We can also specify instructions for some of the generic fields, such as the project summary, so that the information is tailored to the call requirements. Here you can see I can basically turn on or off sections or fields using these radio buttons. So I can either enable or disable entire sections of the application. So I can just turn these on or off if I want to. Or specific fields such as this letters of support here. All of these rules allow us to alter the application's content. On the budget tab, we can set up the minimum and maximum values for the request amount. These settings will be enforced as validation rules when the applicant tries to submit. That way, every program call can have different request amount validations without having to change the application configuration. If a budget table is needed, we can choose the sections that we want to appear in the budget. On the application, I'll only see the budget table section selected on the call. I save that. That should change what I see on my budget. This review scorecard tab lets us set up the external reviews. We can tailor the reviewer instructions to this particular program or call, set up the review deadlines, and then even set up the scorecard questions. So by choosing the number of review criteria, the additional setup fields are displayed. We enter the text of the question, any instructions for the reviewer. In this case, I didn't add any. And then we have the select value answer options here. I can give them a numeric equivalent as well so that I can use that in my score calculations. We can also give each question a weight so that when the scores are calculated, it's weighted correctly against the other criteria. You can see that here. The Report Rules tab allows us to set the frequency, number, and types of reports that will be required from awarded grantees. These can be unique to a program or even to each call. So will progress reports be needed? If so, how many and at what frequency? So I can choose different frequencies here. I can say maybe I want 2 reports annually, and then it will calculate the number of reports to create based on what I choose there. How about a final report? So if I want a final report, I can even say when I want it to be due, and then it will use the numbers selected here to calculate the due date of that final report based on the project end date. Then I can say whether or not I want site visits to be required. The last thing I'll show you here is the ability to add custom questions to the application. This is extremely useful for streamlining your base or common application and also allowing the flexibility to gather program-specific data for evaluation. So here we have the ability to add up to 4 additional narrative, radio button, and checkbox questions. So staff simply has to define the caption of each question, add the instructions if needed, and then for the radio button and checkbox questions, add the select values. When the applicant starts their application, each of these rules is applied. So now I'm going to log in as an applicant, and then I'll show you what that looks like. Because we defined an eligibility quiz, when I start my application, that's the first thing I see. And then the question that we defined on the call has to be answered yes to be considered eligible. Remember, we also define the content of the messages that appear when the applicant passes or fails. Once I hit my draft application, I can see all of the custom call selections reflected in the application, starting with the instructions to the applicant at the top, and then in the project summary here. On the Project Details tab, I see the common questions that are always on the application. But then I can also see custom questions in the additional Project Details section, the narrative, radio button, and checkbox questions that I just set up on the call, along with their select values that I configured earlier. And then here are the other sections that I elected on my call to include. So you can see I included project demographics and partners. On the budget, if you remember when we selected each expense category on the call, so now I can see those expense categories reflected on my budget. And that budget then is tailored specifically to that call. And then because I selected to include letters of support from the call, now I can see that field to upload those documents here. So I'm going to show you an application that I've already started and that's ready to be submitted. This one here. So remember how we set the maximum request amount to $50,000. And you can see here that I'm requesting over that amount. When I try to submit, my validation rule kicks in because it's based on that maximum that I set on the call. So I can't submit it until I correct that value. And now I'm allowed to submit it. And if I go back in as staff, so I'll just end my session here, and I find the application that I just submitted. Now I can set up my external review, because if you remember on my call, I said that I wanted to include an external review. So on this application, I've already preset my reviewer contacts here. So once I move it to under review, my scorecard is created. Give that a second. And I just wanted to show you that when I open my scorecard, all that review criteria that I set up, including the weights, including my select values here, including the number of questions that I defined on the call, are all visible on my scorecard, and everything matches. So what I've shown you today are just some of the ways that you can design flexibility into your application process by leveraging your program manager to build smarter applications. So here are some things to take away from this webinar. Simplifying your grant application process by using a common application is a good practice that helps grantees better understand the expectations and keeps your business process streamlined. But enhancing your common application with business rules that program staff can easily set up from cycle to cycle or call to call, rather than having to reconfigure your applications and workflows, saves a lot of time, effort, and cost. This makes adding new grant programs or changing requirements from year to year much easier.
All right, thank you, Jamie, for that presentation and demo. We do have quite a few questions for you in the chat. So we'll go ahead and get started as we're nearing our time. The first question submitted was, who is the audience for this demo right now? Like the organizations creating the calls or the folks responding?
Oh, it would be the organizations that are creating the calls. So the target audience would be grant staff, program staff, SmartSimple Foundation staff that are setting up calls so that applicants can apply.
Awesome. Another question submitted was, is this solution FedRAMP compliant?
This SmartSimple is not FedRAMP compliant to the best of my knowledge. Yeah. Sorry.
Awesome. Does this solution support external review, scoring, and evaluation comments of apps submitted similar to the federal ARM system?
I'm not familiar with the federal ARM system, but it's definitely supportive of external reviews. So I did show you the review scorecard that can be tailored to a specific reviewer role and then made available in a reviewer portal so that users external to the organization can log in and conduct reviews and evaluations on applications.
Another question submitted is, does this solution also serve as the post-award solution for reporting administration for awardees?
Yes, definitely. So we did talk a little bit about setting up the reporting requirements on the call. So you can set up all kinds of activities on your application, such as reports. So you can have progress reports, final reports, financial reports, and then you can have other activities like site visits, risk assessments, data collection, all kinds of different types of post-award activities that you might conduct with your awarded grantees.
Awesome. And another question is, do the custom added questions act like a normal custom field that can be pulled into reports and list views?
So that's a really good question, and I'm glad you brought that up because that is one a little bit of a drawback of doing this. We typically think of those custom added questions as just sort of bonus questions. It's a little bit more difficult to pull those into reports. You can do it, but you might not get consistent results with your reporting. So I would use it a little bit with caution for that reason, just because it's more difficult to pull them into reports. I would keep those kinds of questions in your standard set of common questions that you would ask on your application if they're going to be used for reporting purposes. But that was a great question.
Awesome, thank you. And another question is, can you provide examples of organizations or foundations or federal funding agencies that are using this?
Using the solution or using this SmartSimple product?
Using, it doesn't clarify in the question. If you want to clarify what exactly you meant in that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to name specific clients that we have at eTRANSERVICES, but we have a number of clients here that are using bits and pieces of this solution, including setting up custom review questions, being able to set up different custom questions on the application and things like that.
Types of organizations, they said.
Oh, types of
Foundations for
organizations.
sure.
Yeah, definitely foundations. We have federal clients, we have state, local, and education clients. We have some research organizations and then foundations for sure.
Awesome. And another question, could the eligibility quiz be set up with this functionality, but used for different applications, not just a common application?
Yeah, absolutely. You can set it up for anything. The common application really, in this case, is just a way to say, I'm just going to build one application and then I'm going to make it flexible for all different types of programs. But you can have multiple types of applications too. It doesn't have to be just a single common application. It's just something that I like to recommend to organizations when they do have a lot in common, but there's a little bit of variability, not to have a bunch of application types, but to just have one so that it makes it a little bit more easy to maintain. But you can definitely have different application types that can be wildly different from each other as well.
All right. The person who had asked this question said that they love the common application. We're just not there yet.
Yeah, I saw that.
Are you looking for implementing partners? We are Native American owned.
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that, but if you want to send me an email, and my email is on there, you can definitely contact me directly and we can definitely chat about it.
Yeah. Awesome. And another question that was sent to me,
Lots of questions today.
anonymously was, this is the last one, I believe. Is UDPass a FedRAMP version of SmartSimple?
UDPass is an alternative version of SmartSimple. It's rebranded under the name of UDPass, but it is SmartSimple. It's not currently on the FedRAMP marketplace, but that is something that we're striving towards.
Awesome. Okay, and I think those are the last questions that were submitted in the chat, but we're happy to answer more if you have any. Feel free to unmute your mic or drop any more questions into the chat before we end this call. But in the meantime, while we wait for any more questions, I wanted to let you all know that this QR code will give you access to our YouTube channel, where the recording will be posted by the end of the week. This QR code link will also provide links to our social media sites, so you can follow us for more upcoming webinars. And it will lead you to our contact information and website as well. And I wanted to thank you all so much for being here today and joining us. I hope you can take away from this webinar, get some new ideas and recommendations for making your SmartSimple Program Manager and application process easier to use and easier to manage. Please feel free to contact Jamie, or our contact information is on our website. If we haven't addressed all of your questions today, or if you have any ideas for other webinar topics you'd like us, or that you would like to see. We'll also be sending out a short survey at the end of this webinar on, so if you can please fill out the survey on how we did today. So keep an eye out for that in the next few days. We always appreciate your feedback. And I do see some more questions possibly.
It's
Yes,
mostly
our
thank yous.
contact
Oh,
information
yeah.
is on the screen for the speakers. So Jamie Neal, who presented today's webinar and demo, her email is right there on the screen. Again, you can also scan that QR code and it will take you to the website, which will have more contact information. If you need my contact information as well, I will drop that in the chat for anyone who needs it. And that concludes our webinar. I don't see any more questions in the chat.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamie. Very
Thank you very
well
much.
done. And thank you again to everyone who joined us today.
Thank you. It was great to see, at least in the chat, everybody who joined. And thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.